Long ago, my great grandmother was getting the kids ready for school. It was the 40s, early 40s, late 30s. I know World War II was still going on, and she lived in this old poor farmhouse. She had 3 or 4 kids. Several girls, a couple boys. The husband was at work and was early in the morning. Just your typical everyday average day in the 1940s. They were very poor, and at the time they didn't hardly have any food in the cupboard, and they had apple butter and bread. She was making the children some apple butter sandwiches to take to school for lunch. And there come a knock on the door in the middle of her preparing the sandwiches for the kids. She turned around and looked at the kids. They all looked at the back door. And then pretty soon, there was a knock at the door. So she wiped her hands off on her apron and walked over to the back door and seen a image through the curtain. There was a gentleman on the other side wearing a hat. And as soon as she opened the door, she peeked around the door, and there was an old man with long gray beard, beautiful blue eyes. He took his hat as she was opening the door off, and in a polite manner addressed her and said, "Good morning, ma'am. I was wondering if I could trouble you for something to eat. I'm on a long journey, and my son just got off out of the war, and I'm going to visit him. And I've been walking a long distance, and I'm quite hungry. And I was wondering if I would be much obliged if you could fix me or give me something to eat." And she politely said, "Well, sir," she said, "we don't have very much, but if you don't mind," she said, "I'm making my children some apple butter sandwiches to take to school, and I could spare a few for you." And he looked at her, and he nodded his head, and he said, "Well, God bless you, ma'am. I'm quite hungry, and I sure would appreciate it." So she politely shut the door, and he stood outside and waited. And she went over and prepared him 2 apple butter sandwiches and wrapped them in a cloth, a linen cloth. They didn't have plastic baggies back in those days, but she remembers wrapping it in a linen cloth for him, so when he got done he would have that cloth. She felt impressed to give it to him. And she wrapped up the sandwiches real nice and neat in a cloth. She politely walked over to the door and opened it and handed it over to him. And he nodded his head and said, "God bless you, ma'am. I sure appreciate it." And he turned around and walked away. she shut the door and she peeked through the curtain of the door to make sure the gentleman got out of the yard and walked down the road. It was a foggy spring morning, and she sat and stared at him, and of course the kids were arguing in the back, being kids, and she was shushing them and telling them to quiet down and get their stuff, get their books, and get ready to walk to school. She peeked over and she looked out and she seen, and as the mist was coming over the road, she said that she seen the gentleman walk through the mist and disappeared. Her heart started racing, and her heart just started pumping, and she felt goosebumps. She felt odd. She couldn't believe what she just saw. And she hurried up and flew out the back door and off the porch and started yelling, running down the road. There was nowhere else he could have gone. To the left he would have gone through a field. To the right he would have had to have crossed a ditch and go over a fence. And the road was several miles long and wasn't another house, at least for 200 yards. And he didn't make it that far. And she ran down the road yelling for him. "Sir? Sir? Hello, sir?" She didn't know if he fell. She didn't know. She just ran down the road, yelling, "Sir? Are you okay, sir?" But nothing. Nothing. There was no one in sight. And she walked back to the house, thinking to herself, what just happened? What happened? As she told me the story, she knew. She knew in her heart what had happened. That you never know when you will be visited by an angel. I am Bob, and this is Genesis Cipher.